The Open Curtain, Chapter 6. It was essential, Red's senior English teacher Mrs. Madison insisted, that they learn how to do research. Whether they were going on to college or planning to work in the common sector, researching was a useful skill. For several days, attempting to convince herself as much as the students, Mrs. Madison kept repeating the words common sector until Rudd found them lodged in his own head. On the third day, Jenny Kent, a pale and freckled redhead whose cheeriness had suffered a setback after her sister's drug overdose and subsequent death the year before, called the bluff and asked how research could possibly be important in the common sector. Mrs. Madison made the mistake of resorting to day-to-day, hands-on examples.
Say you're working in a grocery store and a customer asks you a fact about broccoli. You've got to know how to research it.
"I'd tell her to ask the manager," said Jenny. The class laughed. Mrs. Madison shook her head. She stood before the class looking somewhat bedraggled. She hooked her stringy hair behind an ear.
"No," she said. "Say it's not something the grocery store manager would know offhand. Something else."
"Like what?"
"What culture was the first to use broccoli as a food?"
"I don't want to know that." Laughter again.
"But what if a customer wants to know?"
"I tell her to go ask the manager. If the manager doesn't know, that's his problem, not mine."
"Look," said Mrs. Madison, her voice rising. "Research is just important. It just is."
Rudd found himself on both sides, sympathizing with Mrs. Madison, whom he liked, who seemed to like him, yet wanting to laugh. It was not as simple as feeling torn, for while at one moment he was torn, in the next he found himself at a cold remove, the people and the room as a whole crystalline and distinct. Common sector, he heard in his head, the speech in the room and the laughter coming to him as though swaddled in cotton. Common sector. This coldness was, he felt he somehow knew, the way that Lael must feel all the time. He felt that if he had been before a mirror, he would see not his own face, but the face of his half-brother. He tried to catch his reflection in Mrs. Madison's glasses, but she was too far away. And almost immediately the vibratory moment passed. There were strange, spattered moments like that where he felt he had understood something about his half-brother, something he could never quite verify and which he could hardly ask Lael about. As if in the weekly proximity to Lael had weakened his skin and let his brother leak in. As he rode on the back of the scooter, his face pressed against Lael's back, he felt that even once he was separated from him, he would be joined to him still. Lael did not seem to feel this. It was as if Lael remained always unscathed, self-contained. Lael could leak into him, but not he into Lael. What he felt only rarely and infrequently, the cold remove, seemed to him, at least as far as he could tell, Lael's dominant state. For if Lael felt anything, he rarely expressed it, and anything Lael did express toward Rudd felt pasted on, not so much an actual feeling as a kind of taunt or dare. Yet perhaps he had gotten his half-brother all wrong. Rudd stared at the blank sheet of paper. He was asked to write down ideas. "Ideas for what?" he said. "For the research topic, stupid," Steve Kilpatrick told him. On the blackboard, overlaying a haze of chalk dust, had been written, "Start simple. Where would you like to live? What is your heritage? What decade fascinates you? Who is your hero?" He did not have any heroes, he told himself. None at all. In Sunday school, when he was 12, they'd asked him the same question, some strategy for an object lesson, and he sat there holding his pencil trying to come up with something. When they went around the circle giving their responses, he hadn't known what to say, so remained silent until they passed him by. "Jesus," the others had said, except for one who said, "Rush Limbaugh." He copied the questions off the blackboard and onto his paper, leaving 4 blank lines between each. "Where would you like to live?" "Springville," he wrote, then crossed it out and wrote, "Anywhere but here." But on reflection it seemed like the sort of response likely to get him into trouble. Debbie White, seated next to him, had written California. He knew that he wanted to be as far from Debbie White as possible. He crossed his phrase out and wrote, "New York." "What is your heritage?" He did not know what to say. His father was dead, and his mother, he felt, had reduced him in memory to a nonspecific and general figure of good, a sort of vague and lifeless avatar of Mormon ideals. Yet his father, he knew, had slept with Anne Korth, had perhaps even been secretly and polygamously married to her or perhaps simply had no qualms, despite being an avatar of Mormonism, about committing adultery. But for the purpose of a school assignment, he would give both his father and his mother the benefit of the doubt. Mormonism, he wrote, in the classical sense. What decade fascinates you? What was this about? What did Mrs. Madison want to hear? He looked up and judged her hairstyle, the cut of her white dress, then wrote 1900s. Mrs. Madison was in the front of the class, hands behind her back, stepping tentatively from one end of the blackboard to the other. When he capped his pen, she hurried to his desk.
Finished?
She asked.
May I?
She took the sheet of paper off of his desk, read through it quickly.
Surely you have a hero.
Not really.
It doesn't have to be someone famous, Rudd, she said. It could be anyone. Your father, say.
My father's dead, he said.
I'm sorry,
she said, and pretended to be reading the list again. He died in the common sector, Rudd thought to himself, though he knew this was not precisely true.
So what do we have, she said. New York? Mormonism? 1900s? What's at the intersection of those words?
Nothing, he said.
Now, Rudd, she said, pursing her lips, if you start with that attitude, you're already beaten. Is your glass half full or half empty?
I don't have an effing glass, Rudd thought. Then thought, that's Lael thinking. Half full, he said, and then added, maybe even 3/4 full.
That's the spirit, she said. Now you're talking.
Holding his paper in her hand, she walked to the front of the class, began to speak about what they should do next. He noticed as she spoke that people all around him were crossing out what they'd written, quickly creating better combinations.
We'll be going to the university library, he heard Mrs. Madison tell the class. I've made the arrangements. There you will find a newspaper or magazine of national repute. Look through it to find a news item that combines as many of your 4 answers as possible. So, for instance, she said. Then she held up Rudd's paper. He tried to look nonchalant, but he could feel his ears start to burn, and he knew they had gone red at the tips. F them, thought Rudd. F all. But he knew he hadn't meant it. At least the field trip to the university library meant a few missed classes. She stood them all outside the doors, beside the frieze, a Utah artisan's approximation of Mayan culture. He could also see, from where he stood, the dark bronze figure of an 8-foot Indian. What tribe, he wondered. They were to stay in the periodicals microfilm area. They were not, under any circumstances, to leave the periodicals microfilm area. A field trip of this sort was a privilege. If they needed something that was not in the periodicals microfilm area, they must request the library pass. He watched Mrs. Madison hold up the hall pass she had brought with her from school. They were herded through the doors and then through the clicking, dull green turnstiles. He stared at Ellen Barlow's bare neck just inches away, shuffling his feet so as not to step on her heels. Directly behind him, someone was popping gum. They went through, and he looked behind him. Mark Pollard was the one with the gum. He blew another bubble as Rudd watched, popped it sharply. What? Asked Mark. Nothing, said Rudd, and turned back around. He could feel Mark's hand even before it was on his shoulder, tugging at him, pulling him around. He felt himself growing distant. Why'd you look at me like that? Mark asked. Like what? You know what, said Mark. You want to fight or something? Rudd shook his head no, then, as Mark started to look away, slung his forehead down hard into Mark's mouth and nose. It hurt like hell. When he brought his face back, he could feel the gum sticky and webbed all through his bangs. Mark was gasping, covering his mouth. Immediately there was a hand pinching the back of his neck from behind, hard, a second hand on Mark's neck. Rudd, Mrs. Madison said, suppose you tell me what's going on here. I don't exactly know, he said. I have his gum in my hair. Why exactly is his gum in your hair? And why is his nose bleeding? He looked at her in a way he hoped was innocent. We must have collided? She looked at Mark, who, blood dripping down his chin, just nodded. Mrs. Madison took her hands off their necks. Go wash up, she said. I know you're both lying, but at the moment I'm too busy to care. Once more and I'll see you both suspended." He splashed water through his hair, trying to rake the gum out with his fingers. It came out first in bits, then stopped coming out at all, tightening into clumps. "You're gonna have to cut it out," Mark said, patting his face and nose with a tan, coarse paper towel. He nodded. He looked around for something to cut it with. There was nothing unless he wanted to try sawing it off with the triangular teeth of the paper towel dispenser. He heard a click, and when he turned, Mark held a pearl-handled stiletto in his hand. The blade was dull and oily, longer than his middle finger, twice as thick. "Why'd you do it?" Mark asked. Rudd looked at the knife and shrugged. "I don't know," he said. He really did not know, he realized. He'd still been shaking his head no. He didn't want to fight. When his head had struck forward and through Mark's face of its own accord, it surprised him almost as much as it had Mark. "Why do you have a knife?" he asked. "Don't you like me?" asked Mark. Rudd shrugged again. "I never thought about it much," he said. "I like you good enough." Mark made a slow and awkward pass with the knife, forcing Rudd back a step. He smiled. "Just kiddin'," he said, and handed the knife, haft first, to Rudd. Rudd took the knife and held it, the light winking off the blade's edge and into his eye. Lael, he knew, in his place would probably stab Mark. "I am different from my half-brother. I am my own person." He lifted the knife, began to hack off clumps of his own hair. 1903 sounded like a slow news year. The 1903 New York Times came month by month in a faded yellow box on an open-centered spool, just like every other year, but he couldn't remember having heard the year mentioned in Miss Stahl's The American Tradition class. Perhaps the paper would be stretching for stories and would report on minor human interest sorts of things, something that would come at least marginally close to the parameters forced upon him. He put the microfilm in wrong, and everything was sideways and backwards, the letters turned inside out. The spindle had not gone through the center hole, and the spool inscribed an oval as it turned. The harried reference librarian fixed it for him quickly, casting looks of hatred all the while at Mrs. Madison, who either remained oblivious or was exceptionally skilled at appearing so. He began to crank the reel forward. When he got to the first page on the first day of January, everything was still sideways, and it took him some time to figure out how to rotate the projecting apparatus to get the text to project correctly. Even then, it was still in indifferent focus, strands of the page sharp, the remainder slightly fuzzy and blotted. He started scanning titles. Girl met polite burglar. Something about iron and steel. Polite, he wondered. Taylor to be hanged, but no relation to former Mormon Church President John Taylor as far as he could tell. Then a flash of black, and January 2nd, where boy accidentally kills his brother with rifle. Directly below, ball given in barn. The boy's murder in the present tense, the ball in the past, though both had already occurred. Some significance there, he was willing to bet, but not enough to keep him from cranking through advertisements and on to the next day. Horses tortured in trench, and got carving knife by mail. French painters here. He began cranking faster, flashed past an ad for muslin underclothing. Sultan rewards spies, perhaps by giving them muslin underclothing. Congo raiding to be stopped. Activity in billiards. Does the New York Times still list billiard activity, he wondered? French in an amiable mood. Perhaps because their painters are out of the country. And a few columns later, French murderer not to die. Just one more reason for the French amiability. More billiards. Moving day for Jesuits. Brought dead dog to life. Survived with adrenaline injections 10 hours without a head. Holy hell. He wound the reel back up and took it off, packing it into its box, then went to retrieve the February reel from the pull-out cabinets. He got the reel on and threaded tight. Typhoid spreads at Ithaca. The cakewalk in Vienna. Mr. Morgan burlesqued. A new kind of orchid. Horse kicked and many died. Merit is what sells. Old Crow Rye. It is a straight whiskey and cannot be equaled. Just below, the frisky Mrs. Johnson. Large oysters scarce this year. Uncle Sam holding up some men and rockets wrapped in tape. A political cartoon that made no sense to him. Reverend Robert, street burned to death. Daughter only injured, she will survive. At least this one's related to religion, he thought. He could ask Mrs. Madison if, since he couldn't find anything Mormon, Reverend Robert was close enough. He knew she would acquiesce, but would also tell him he needed in future to persist, because good things come to those who wait. She was always saying crap like that and pronouncing it like a headline. The plague in Mexico. Body discovered by divers. He came to February 3rd. Billiard championship. He could ask to change his topic to billiards, list his hero as a billiard player. Anthracite at retail, right next to easy divorce. Men's $5 shoes for $3.50. Then, turning to February 4th, men's shoes for $2.25. Match caused explosion. Shot woman and self. Important to every home. Silks. Billiard champion lost. Chorus favorite dead. He read about her 102nd anniversary, flashed past the article just below it, registered it only a few pages later. He wheeled back. Hooper Young's trial today. His lawyer will ask further delay. Prosecution blames Mormon, friends and relatives. Jesus, he thought. He'd managed 3 out of 4 categories, purely by hazard. He was a believer now. But in what, he did not know. Research, maybe? Or blind chance? He began to read. William Hooper Young, grandson of Brigham Young, will go to trial this morning before Justice D. Katie Herrick, in the criminal branch of the Supreme Court, on the charge of having murdered Mrs. Anna Nielsen Pulitzer last November. The trial may not proceed, however, for W.F.S. Hart, Young's counsel, will ask for delay on a number of grounds, one of them being that its client is physically unable to withstand the strain of trial. Assistant District Attorney Student reiterated yesterday his statement regarding the disappearance of several witnesses, but said that nevertheless Young would be convicted. While Mr. Student did not lay the disappearance of these witnesses directly at the door of the Mormon Church, he declared emphatically that the Mormon friends and relatives of the defendant were putting forth efforts to defeat the case of the prosecution. Mr. Student pointed to an article which appeared over Young's name in the October number of the Crusader, the magazine edited in Hoboken by the prisoner and his friend Dixie Anser. The article was headed Sunrise in Hell, and in it, Mr. Student said, there appeared more or less vague references to the blood atonement doctrine. It was learned yesterday that while the prosecution would not assume this doctrine had any direct relation to the motive for the murder, it might be used to throw additional light on the tragedy. The blood atonement doctrine teaches that the soul of any Mormon who has gone back on his or her faith may be saved by the shedding of the blood of such a person as was the woman, and that the blessing thus conferred would reflect credit in the other world on the person who commits the deed. Damon Phillips was punching him between the shoulder blades, calling him punk-ass, telling Rudd he had the microfilm machine. Just a minute, Rudd said. I found something. What happened to your hair, punk-ass? Mind your own business, said Rudd. Man, what's wrong with you? You're usually not like this. Like what? Usually you're normal. What do you mean, normal? Damon shrugged. You know, normal. He didn't know what to say. I never know what to say, he told himself. Getting up, he surrendered the machine. He stood leaning against the microfiche cabinets. The Crusader, he thought. Sunrise in Hell. Hardly building blocks for the common sector. Looking through the card catalog, he found no mention of a magazine called The Crusader. He went back to leaning. Well, Rudd, said Mrs. Madison, did you find anything? Yes, he said. Congratulations, he said. I guess that old glass was half full after all. His father's books were in a small, slope-ceiling demi-room halfway up the stairs to the attic. They were in stacks against the walls, empty boxes scattering the space between. He began to look through them, sorting the church books out of the stacks, brushing the dust off of them, stacking them near the door. As he worked, dust spun slowly in the air. When he licked his lips, he tasted dust. Carrying some books down to his bedroom, he spread them on his bed. Mormon Doctrine, one was called, a dictionary of sorts. He opened it, leafed through the A's to the B's, stopped at a section called Blood Atonement Doctrine. See atonement of Christ, calling and election sure, Christ flesh and blood. From the days of Joseph Smith to the present, wickedly and evilly disposed persons have fabricated false and slanderous stories to the effect that the Church, in the early days of this dispensation, engaged in a practice of blood atonement, whereunder the blood of apostles and others was shed by the Church as an atonement for their sins. These claims are false, and were known by their originators to be false. There is not one historical instance of so-called blood atonement in this dispensation, nor has there been one instance or occurrence whatever of any nature from which the slightest inference arises that any such practice either existed or was taught. Next to the passage someone, probably his father, had written, untenable, cf. Confessions of John D. Lee, or even the practice of swearing upon pain of death not to reveal the ceremonies of the Mormon temple. He skipped down a few lines. The true doctrine of blood atonement is simply this. 1. Jesus Christ worked out the infinite and eternal atonement by the shedding of his own blood. He came into the world for the purpose of dying on the cross for the sins of the world. By virtue of their atoning sacrifice, immortality came as a free gift to all men, and all who would believe and obey his laws would, in addition, be cleansed from sin through his blood. 2. But under certain circumstances there are some serious sins for which the cleansing of Christ does not operate, and the law of God is that men must then have their own blood shed to atone for their sins. Murder, for instance, is one of these sins. Hence we find the Lord commanding capital punishment. Thus, also, if a person is so progressed in righteousness that his calling and election has been made sure, if he has come to that position where he knows by revelation and the spirit of prophecy, through the power of the holy priesthood, that he's sealed up unto eternal life, D and C 131, 19-5, then if he gains forgiveness for certain grievous sins, he must be destroyed in the flesh, and delivered unto the buffetings of Satan unto the day of redemption, saith the Lord God. D and C 132, 19-27. President Joseph Spealing Smith had written, man may commit serious grievous sins, according to his lighted knowledge, that will place him beyond the reach of the atoning blood of Christ. If then he would be saved, he must make sacrifice of his own life to atone, so far as in his power lies, for that sin, for the blood of Christ alone under certain circumstances will not avail. Joseph Smith taught that there were certain sins so grievous that man may commit, that they will place the transgressors beyond the power of the atonement of Christ. If these offenses are committed, then the blood of Christ will not cleanse them from their sins even though they repent. Therefore their only hope is to have their own blood shed to atone, as far as possible, in their behalf. Next to the last sentence his father had marked an asterisk. He heard noise from the hallway, turned the book face down. It was his mother. When she saw the book spread around him, she smiled. "You're finding your faith at last," she said, moving forward to embrace him. "You returned to the fold." It was all he and Lael spoke of the next time he met. Lael at first feigning lack of interest, then gradually coming around. He'd not heard of Hooper Young, he admitted, but he did know something of blood sacrifice. He told Rudd about the Laffertys, 2 brothers, a few years earlier, one a bishop or a former bishop, he couldn't remember which, who sacrificed one of their wives and their child at a makeshift altar and slit her throat so the blood would run over the altar to baptize it, and the words blood sacrifice were used, but there had been nothing as flagrant as writing about it in advance. Sunrise in hell, was it? "There's a lot of effed up people in the world," said Lael, and then leaned forward. "What else do you know about him?" "Not much," he said. "Isn't there more?" "I didn't have time to check." "And by the way," said Lael, "what happened to your hair?" He reached up to feel his hair, his bangs still uneven though he'd tried to cut them straight. It surprised him that Lael had noticed his hair at all. Perhaps Lael was paying more attention than he realized. He was mulling this over when Lael stood and climbed onto the scooter. Before Rudd knew it, they were on their way down from the canyon and back to the library, Lael taking the curves and slopes quickly as Rudd slid on the seat, trying to hang on. There was a lot to it, more than Rudd had first guessed. The Times, Lael found through a guide the reference librarian recommended, had reported copiously on the crime, on Hooper Young's identification and capture, and then, almost 5 months later, the trial. He sat cranking the records up one by one, reading the articles as Lael peered over his shoulder. Only months later was he able to think it into coherent form. At first glance it all just washed over him without really sinking in, and he left the library with names and places churning through his mind. But eventually, Though he never articulated it clearly as he wanted, it all came together. On September 19th, 1902, a woman's body was found in a mud ditch between New York and New Jersey, nude and lying in slime. A leather strap was wound about her waist, knotted at the back, and affixed to a 20-pound hitch weight of a peculiar make. The woman's skull had been fractured in 2 places, once just above the right eye, again a few inches above the left temple. A smoothly cut gash, about 6 inches long, extended diagonally down from her left side through her belly. Autopsy reports indicated it was this gash that killed her, despite there being no interior hemorrhage, nor any punctured or slit internal organs. The incision was made either by a knife with blunt and rugged edge, or by a knife in the hand of a nervous person. The blows to the head, because of the absence of cerebral hemorrhaging, were thought to have been dealt by a man of no extraordinary strength. It might have been caused by a fist or a sandbag, but not by any blunt or hard weapon. Though at high tide the ditch was full and the body thus covered, at low tide the ditch drained to about 6 inches of water. The murderer was apparently either unfamiliar with the area or was in such hurry to dispose of the body that he was imprudent. The body was seen at 1 in the afternoon by the motorman of a passing trolley car, who notified the inspector at a nearby drawbridge, who in turn notified the police. According to that first report, it was beyond a doubt the 2 men were concerned with the disposition of the body, if not in the murder itself. A bridgeman spoke of a closed cab passing at 11 p.m. on the night before the discovery of the body, a quite uncommon occurrence, driven by 2 rather young and well-dressed men, who kept their heads averted when the bridgeman stopped them and held up the lantern. The cab's curtains were tightly drawn. The vehicle went through the bridge and along the road that paralleled the ditch in which the body was discovered, but no other bridgeman could recall it coming out. The corpse was Mrs. Anna Pulitzer, wife of tailor Joseph Pulitzer. Her husband, reading of the body's discovery in the morning papers, called police and asked to see it, which he immediately identified as his wife of 5 years. A civil-minded citizen, Pulitzer had worked as an election captain on the day of the murder was thought to have occurred, arriving home shortly before 11 p.m. His wife, who had not gone to bed at that hour, said she wanted to buy some fruit, started out to buy some. She took all her rings off except her wedding ring, left them at the house. Then she went out and was never seen again by him alive. She was last seen in the bakery at 11:40 at night, where she bought some rolls. When Pulitzer identified the body, he was immediately locked up until his story was investigated and, to the degree it could be, corroborated. By the next day, the paper announced, "Slayer of Mrs. Anna Pulitzer is known." It identified him as William Hooper Young, grandson of Mormon leader Brigham Young. Young was described as extremely dark, with a sallow complexion, a slender figure, bushy eyebrows that stand out conspicuously over small black eyes. He was between 30 and 35 years old, weighed 130 pounds. He'd worked for newspapers on both coasts, was known as a reckless character and a debauchee. He is described as half adventurer, half newspaperman. He was the son of John W. Young, a financier. One of Young's co-workers of the Weekly Crusader, a fellow named Anser, had heard Young speak of returning a borrowed horse and rig to a particular stable. Anser, having read the murder, felt the fact worth mentioning to the police. Police approached the liveryman, who positively identified Young as the man who had taken the rig and returned it without either weight or leather strap. When they went to Young's father's apartments, where Young had been staying while his father was in Europe, evidences of a most repulsive murder were discovered. In the first bedroom of the apartment were bloody sheets, pools of blood in a closet, and a large knife. Captain Schmidberger said he believed the murderers gave the woman knockout drops and lured her to the place, intending at first to cut up the body and get rid of the pieces. From the blood stains on the kitchen sink and in the bedroom closet, it's inferred that the body might have been concealed in either one of those places. 2 days earlier, Young had left the house with a steamer trunk, which the bellboy had helped him load into the rented rig. Then, the following day, the trunk had been brought back to the house, then had to be shipped, according to the bellboy, to Chicago. Yet, despite declaring Young guilty, the Times in the same article pointed to other details that seemed to implicate another man, an unidentified gentleman, described as very stout, who called upon Mrs. Pulitzer the afternoon of her disappearance, rushing upstairs, saying, "She expects me." He was described as a clean-shaven man, very heavy, dark, and rather Jewish or German in appearance, with a heavy gold watch chain and a gold cigar cutter hanging to his vest. On Sunday, September 21st, Young's arrest is expected hourly. The police believed he had not yet been apprehended because he was being protected by the Mormons, for according to the New York police captain, "There was once in this city a secret society of Mormons. I believe it still exists. It was broken up once by the United States Secret Service Bureau, but it's going along in quiet, I believe. Although the members of his former church say he's a recreant member and a villain, they will stick to him. He was once sanctified, so he must be protected." The steamer trunk that Young had been shipped to Chicago arrived and was seized by the Chicago police, who sent a dispatch indicating that it contained women's dress, underclothes, hat, shoes, men's clothing, dirk knife, all smeared with blood, and nearly 100 letters addressed to William Hooper Young. The articles of feminine apparel were marked with the name or initial of Mrs. Anna Pulitzer. In addition, the trunk contained memorandum book containing name William Hooper Young. On the first page of another memorandum book found in Young's father's apartment itself were written the words "blood atonement," followed by half a dozen scriptural references that, when examined, seemed related to the Mormon doctrine of blood atonement. The local Mormon authority denied the existence of blood atonement, declaring there to be no such thing in the religion. He denied absolutely that there was any doctrine of Mormon church which demanded the shedding of blood as an atonement for sin. He said that there was not one of the doctrines of the church which would give even a man partially deranged the idea that in killing a woman for his own sins would be forgiven. "My father," said Rudd, "our father, I mean, wrote that it did exist." "What did?" "Aren't you here yet?" said Rudd, pointing to the subtitle, "Blood Atonement Denied." "Why would I be there?" "That Hooper Young might have discussed the idea of blood atonement is possible. He had erroneous ideas on many subjects. This idea did not prompt his terrible crime," Rudd read. Lale shrugged. "No comment?" said Rudd. "What else could a Mormon speaking on behalf of the church possibly say? Yes, we do kill people?" Both the police and reporters had begun to speak with confidence that Young was the murderer. Despite the belief of both parties several days before that there had been two men involved in the disposal of the body, perhaps in the murder itself, Young was declared the sole and singular murderer. The captain of police received a letter as well from H. Young, stating that he intended to commit suicide. "Search in vain. Have killed myself. H. Young." The letter was written on a scrap of cheap white paper and enclosed in a small envelope such as used for visiting cards. The captain believed it was a letter from some crank, though he decided to have experts compare the handwriting to that of Hooper Young. "One of the most startling developments of yesterday was the discovery by Captain Titus that a murder bearing such similarity to this one was committed in Salt Lake City, Utah in 1893. A Frenchman was murdered here that year, he said, and this Young was living in Salt Lake City at the time. No one could find the Frenchman's body, nor could they trace the murderer. A long time afterward, the body was found in a trunk that had been shipped to Chicago. I do not say that Young committed this murder out west, but it seems highly probable that his mind was affected by it. Of course, the two cases differ, but still they are similar. A trunk was sent to Chicago in each case. In both the trunks was evidence that the murderer was attempting to conceal." "Why Chicago?" asked Rudd. Lale read the paragraphs Rudd pointed to and shrugged. "Copycat?" he said. "Unless he killed the Frenchman, too." "Do you think he did?" "It's more interesting if he didn't," said Lale. "That he had in his head from the first killing the idea that all murdered bodies should be shipped to Chicago." "You think he was crazy?" "Crazy's not the right word," said Lale. "Possessed, maybe." "You think that happens? Somebody goes to see a movie about murderers and then they go out and kill people?" Lale shrugged. "Sure," he said. "But the person has to want it to happen first. Some people are just aching for an excuse." The chief detective said that he'd found letters in Young's flat that proved the man to be a moral pervert. In addition, he had a very peculiar walk, as though something was the matter with his legs, and I think anybody who ever saw him could identify him by his gait among a million men. Other tenants in his father's building described him as a dope and a vagabond. He'd gone to the roof often and acted queerly. When anybody saw him, they would dodge behind chimneys. He was a cigarette fiend. He was a brilliant talker. Haggard. He was the most attractive fellow you ever saw. He was well educated, perfectly honest, and seemingly well balanced. He was quiet, did not seem freakish in any way. By Monday, September 22nd, a man disguised as a tramp, but matching Hooper Young's description, was picked up in Derby, Connecticut, after a scuffle. The man refused to give his name or account for his whereabouts. His face resembled Young's. Upon being apprehended, his clothing, though trampish in appearance, proved to be new. He was said to have a look of refinement about him which does not become the clothes he wears. The nervous condition of a man is such that it would appear that he is on the verge of collapse, and he is restless in a most exaggerated degree. It was thought by the arresting officers that Young had a gold tooth, which they looked for, but instead was a hole in the gum where a tooth had been extracted quite recently. In the same article, Captain Titus insisted that the police descriptions of Young, no mention of a gold tooth was made. Young has no gold teeth. His pockets were full of red pepper. A packet of red pepper, it was discovered, was found in the trunk sent to Chicago as well. As more details surfaced about how Young spent his time after the murder, the motivation for the crime began to seem more complex to Captain Titus. All this is certain. After buying the clothes in which he was clad when he hired the rig in Hoboken, he must have spent some more money, including what he paid the liveryman. While he was pawning the jewelry and getting the buggy, the body of his victim was resting in his bedroom closet, covered with blood. By all who saw him during his preparations for the disposal of the body, it is stated that he was very calm and collected. A man who could stroll around without excitement while the woman he'd killed lay in his apartment must have been a hardened and deliberate criminal. The crime deliberate. Captain Titus said he's come to the conclusion that not only the motive of robbery had entered in the crime, but that the murder had been deliberate. I argue, said the captain, that if robbery had been the only motive, Young might as just as well carried the woman into insensibility. When he carried her to his flat, he knew he would have to kill her as well as rob. Joseph Pulitzer insisted, though it had not been mentioned in earlier interviews, that just a few hours prior to her disappearance, his wife had been accosted by a man resembling Young who'd proposed that she visit his apartment. How Pulitzer knew this, or why he wasn't troubled by it, remains unclear. More importantly, according to Mrs. Pulitzer's parents, the murdered woman had known Young for 9 years. There were some hints made suggesting that she'd followed Young north to Jersey City, and then to New York. The man disguised as a tramp at first denied he was Hooper Young, claiming instead to be Bert Edwards, until the police brought him into contact with an athletic instructor who knew Young, Mac Levy. "Hello, Hooper." There was no response. Young turned his eyes on the speaker deliberately, looked hard at him with no sign of recognition. If there was any effort in his assumption of indifference, it was not visible. There was a long pause. Finally, as if he thought he was expected to say something, he answered, "I don't know you." "Of course you know me," said Levy, placing his hand on the former friend's shoulder. Young, without trace of emotion, responded, "You should be sure of your identification. This is a terrible crime for which I am held." After this, at the command of the officers, the prisoner divested himself of his clothing, so that Levy might make the identification more certain. It was then that the man admitted for the first time that he was William Hooper Young. When questioned about his guilt, Young answered cryptically, yes and no, and hinted at the existence of an accomplice in the murder, though at this stage he would not identify an accomplice by name, nor would he quite admit to having been involved in the crime. He failed to give any account for his movements since leaving his flat after the murder, nor would he give the police any information as to his whereabouts during the time the body of the woman remained in his room. Once Young was caught, the full and complete contents of the trunk sent to Chicago could be revealed. When they raised the lid, the first thing that came to sight was a sword-shaped stiletto, with a blade several inches long and an ivory handle. The blade was covered with bloodstains. In a paper bag touching the knife were 6 mixed cakes, the same which the murdered woman had brought in the bakery at 7th Avenue and 48th Street 10 minutes after she'd left her husband last Tuesday night, and a few minutes before she was lured or consented to go to the place where death awaited her. The next thing to come to sight was her set of false teeth, one of which was missing, and under them, covered with bloodstains, were skirts and underwear. A switch of false hair and a pair of gloves were sandwiched in with the other articles. The sides of the trunk were streaked with blood. One corner there was a big splotch. Besides the things already mentioned, there were found in the trunk the missing bedclothes from the Young apartment, 3 pairs of men's old shoes, Young's trousers and coat, vest, undershirt, some red pepper, a hairpin, a bent safety pin. Some of the clothing was torn. There were also stains on the man's clothing and on a broken comb in a pocketbook found at the very bottom of the trunk. Young's father in Paris sent a cable urging Young to cooperate, promising to stand by him if he did so. He engaged a lawyer, William F.S. Hart, who expressed the opinion that if Young were guilty, he was certainly insane. He did not think him guilty, however. A newspaper from Portland, where Young had once lived, suggested Young seemed to be a man who was easily influenced, and his friends say it was almost possible for him to be led into anything, if inducements were offered. He was very studious and carried a Bible with him at all the times. He was very fond of discussing religious topics, and when not at work was to be found reading biblical literature. The Seattle chief of police telegraphed New York saying that Young was wanted on 2 charges of forgery. Rudd's eyes had begun to hurt. He stood up, stretched his arms, heading for the door. Lael kept reading, paying no attention to where Rudd was going. Rudd left the reading room, walked down the hallway until he found a drinking fountain. He stood pressing the button, the water bubbling out, waiting for it to get cold. When he got back, Lael had taken his chair. He flipped forward to the next day, the next article. Rudd sat behind him, reading over his shoulder, squinting sometimes to make out the words. Young says another did the actual murder. Protests he tried to revive Mrs. Pulitzer after the crime. About 3 weeks ago, I met a man named Charles Elling in Central Park. He accosted me. We talked and got acquainted, though he was a degenerate. After that, he called on me several times in my flat. On the night Mrs. Pulitzer died, Elling and I met her at the Broadway and 46th Street by an appointment I'd made. We went to the flat together. I went out for some whiskey after we got there, leaving Elling and the woman alone. When I got back, I found Mrs. Pulitzer lying across the bed with a gag in her mouth. Elling had gone. I ripped open her clothing and moved her hands back and forth over her head to induce respiration. When she didn't breathe, I put my hand under her waist and felt her heart. It was not beating. Then I decided to notify the police. I thought I would have to go to police headquarters instead of calling a policeman. I thought police headquarters was in the city hall. I got on a train and started downtown, and on the way I got to thinking what a lot of disgrace the affair would bring on me and my father. That made me decide to get rid of the body. I took a long knife and cut into the body, intending to cut it up so I could get it into a trunk. But after I'd made the first cut, my courage failed, and I could go no farther. Mrs. Pulitzer's murder has not lost all its mystery, as the police had expected it would as soon as Young had been caught. The prisoner told them that he could not remember where he'd been since he left New York, nor did he explain the injuries to the head and face of the dead woman. Captain Schmidberger was eager to point out that the similarities between the murder of Anna Pulitzer and the 1900 murder of Kate Feely in New York. Feely disappeared after speaking to someone of Young's appearance. Her body was spread throughout the city, dismembered, though the head itself was never found. Schmidberger felt that Young's indication that he wanted to dismember the body linked the murders. Young, sleeping in jail, took an unflagging interest in newspaper reports of the murder. Police, searching for someone matching Elling's description, discovered nobody. They continued to claim that no such person existed. There was a man of similar description who had checked himself into Harlem Hospital, suffering from a dose of muriatic acid, under the name of Charles Garnett, hinting he was from Bridgeport, Connecticut, the town Young claimed Elling was from. I want to die, Garnett suggested as he checked himself in. What have you done? Asked a surgeon. I know what I've done, he said, and I want to die. He declined to say anything about himself. Later, when told that he would die, he answered, All right. Then he was asked if he came from Bridgeport. If I tell you where I come from, he said, you'll hang me. Yet police continued to claim that 1. Elling did not exist, and that 2. Garnett was certainly not Elling, even if he did exist. It was discovered who Young had purchased his trunk from, though this raised certain complications. The trunk dealer insisted Young had no mustache when he purchased his trunk, though numerous people had seen him with a mustache on that day, and on the day before and after. He didn't have a mustache, but he looked like the pictures of Young. This led some to believe that Young had an accomplice after all. In October of 1902, the coroner's jury declared that, from the evidence adduced, we find she came to her death by violence at the hands of William Hooper Young. 7 days later, a grand jury indicted Young for murder in the first degree. Mention of Young disappeared from the paper for more than 3 months, reappearing in February, as his trial approached and as several of the witnesses against him disappeared. the district attorney placed the blame for their disappearance on the Mormon Church. On February 4th was the article that Rudd had first seen. He read it through again, then watched Lale's eyes flick back and forth until he'd finished as well. He cranked forward a day. Young, unable to finish the trial, had managed to have proceedings delayed a day, and sought to have them delayed further. Hart, his lawyer, begged for a delay on the grounds that his client was physically unable to stand the strain of trial. The court coroner, recruited as a physician, examined Young and declared him too ill to leave his cell. Justice Herrick, after another examination by another doctor, ordered Young to attend. Young was literally dragged into court between two deputy sheriffs. He appeared to be in a state of great physical weakness, and seemed to have aged at least 20 years since the time of his arrest in September. The deathly pallor of his features was in pronounced contrast to the long, shaggy black beard which he'd grown while in prison. Had it not been for his luminous brown eyes, the face would have resembled a death mask more than anything else. He wore no collar, and his linen and other clothing were in a state of neglect. When he was taken to the chair at the table of his counsel, he collapsed and fell forward. After a further examination by 8 physicians, the justice decided the trial would continue. At first, Young sat in various attitudes of dejection, and at times his head swayed weakly from side to side. But after the proceedings began in earnest, he seemed to brighten up and take interest in what was going on around him. He scanned each talisman, called with manifest care, and regarded each jury sworn intensely. By the following day, his appearance seemed further improved. His hair was combed, his beard had been trimmed, and he wore a collar. But he still showed signs of great weakness, and once in the afternoon session he wept. Yet the reason he looked good was only because he'd been dressed by the combined efforts of 3 prison guards. Indeed, when they first arrived, he'd not been dressed at all. They found him crawling about his cell on all fours, searching for a rabbit's foot. By the following day, he'd assumed an attitude of dull dejection, his head resting on the table before him, his face buried in his hands. On February 10th, only 6 days after his trial begun, it was over. Young admits his guilt, confesses murder in the 2nd degree, and gets life sentence. Justice Herrick advised his counsel to enter that plea. Man medically, but not legally, insane. William Hooper Young, who'd been on trial before Justice Herrick in the criminal branch of the Supreme Court for the murder of Mrs. Anna Pulitzer, yesterday pleaded guilty to murder in the 2nd degree. Young looked like a changed man when he entered court yesterday morning. For the first time he walked by himself up to the table of his counsel, where he pulled his chair into position and sat down. His eye was clear, he bore his head erect, and he looked like a man from whose mind a great burden had been rolled. All in the courtroom wondered over his altered appearance. After the whispered conference, Clerk Penny of the court called the defendant to the bar. There was a brief silence when he entered the room, and Justice Herrick ordered the prisoner to stand up. "Young," said Justice Herrick, "I understand that you want to recall your plea of not guilty and enter a plea of guilty of murder in the 2nd degree." Young stood up, clutching the railing in front of him with both hands. He seemed calm and unperturbed. Prompted by Mr. Hart, he said something which the judge construed into assent. "Do you desire to be sentenced now?" asked the judge. "There is no occasion to comment on the heinousness of the crime you have committed," said Justice Herrick then. "You are aware of the penalty for your crime. The sentence of the court is that you be taken and confined to state prison at hard labor for the term of your natural life." Young sank back in his chair. There was an expression of relief on his face. He soon was taken away, and as soon as the doors leading to the prison pen had closed on him, Justice Herrick made his explanation to the jury. "It is only right," said Justice Herrick, "to tell you, gentlemen, that the court advised the defendant's counsel to tender this plea, and that the court also advised the district attorney to accept it. The man's mental condition was the cause for the action taken. You are aware that this man has been under medical observation. The experts reported this man legally sane, but insane from the medical point of view. He therefore is supposed to know the difference between right and wrong, and should be held responsible. But as his insanity has been reported to me as being of the progressive order, it is difficult to tell where one line merges into the other."